Introducir a nuestro próximo panel, que será en inglés y es Redefining Business Purpose in a Changing World. Vamos a ver que tendremos al profesor Colin. Habrá traducción simultánea, es verdad. Así que yo no sé cómo te puedes conectar, lo veréis, ¿no? Veréis como un iconito para poder pinchar y ver. Mira, qué bien, ¿qué tal? Buenos días.
María Ángeles, buenos días.
Buenos días, Jordi. Pues qué bien, ya tenemos a uno de los ponentes aquí conectado. ¿Nos oyes bien, verdad?
Perfectamente.
Y nosotros...
¿También me oís bien?
Muy bien, muy bien. Y te vemos fenomenal también.
Estupendo.
Bueno, y ahora nos faltaría Colin, a ver si lo vemos también. Y arrancamos. Pero mira, ya que estás aquí tú... y que quiero hacer tu introducción en español porque me hace mucha ilusión tenerte aquí en nuestra casa. Voy presentando un poco tu perfil, que es medio folio y se ha quedado corto. Entonces voy a ver si soy capaz de explicar muy bien todas las cosas que has hecho en tu carrera profesional y las que quedan por hacer. Bueno, Jordi Canals es profesor ordinario de Dirección Estratégica del IESE y presidente del IESE Center for Corporate Governance, que es muy, muy interesante y un sitio en el que incidir muy bien para estos temas. Es titular de la IESE Foundation y Chair of Corporate Governance y fue director general del IESE desde 2001 a 2016, queridísimo por las promociones de esos años, pero por las anteriores y por las que vendrán. Ha sido un referente, yo creo, en la educación de muchos de los líderes de este país y de otros países. Además, eres autor de varios libros, entre ellos Shaping Entrepreneurial Mindsets, de la editorial Macmillan, Building Respected Companies, de la Cambridge University Press, y el informe, que es muy interesante, Las competencias profesionales del futuro. Un diagnóstico y un plan de acción para promover el empleo juvenil después del COVID-19. No puede estar esto más candente, ¿no? Además ha sido postdoctoral fellow de la Harvard Business School, guest scholar del Fondo Monetario Internacional, que esto es muy interesante también y muy difícil, y visiting scholar del Banco Mundial, guest scholar del Brookings Institution. Jordi Canals es doctor en Ciencias Económicas y Empresariales por la Universidad de Barcelona y, como he dicho antes, postdoctoral fellow de la Graduate School of Business Administration de Harvard University, el sueño de cualquier adolescente que quiere empezar una carrera. Bueno, pues ya veo que te has quedado así sin palabras, pero esto eres tú y mucho más que no nos ha dado tiempo a introducir. No sé si está Colin ya también ahí y a lo mejor no le vemos. Esperamos un poquito. Vale, pues mira, Jordi, ya que... mira. Hello, Colin, good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be with you.
Perfect. So then I got you too. I've already introduced Professor Jordi Canals. But I really want to go through your bio in just a few words, but it's so impressive that I really want the audience to know what kind of person we are discussing this morning with. So Colin is the Peter Morse Professor of Management Studies in the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Reputation of the Saïd Business School and the university here in Spain is humongous. Everybody would like to study with you. He is a fellow of the British Academy and the European Corporate Governance Institute. You share this interest in governance with Jordi Canals too. A professoral fellow of the Wadham College of Oxford and an honorary fellow of Oriel College, also of Oxford. He leads the British Academy inquiry into the future of the corporation, which is the UK leading organization for humanities and social sciences. The purpose of this inquiry and the British Academy is to deepen in the understanding of people, very difficult, societies even more, and then cultures. You're crazy with this job. Enabling everyone to learn, progress, and prosper. Prosperity is the main word that is covering the whole day today for us, and how to share this prosperity. It is a great pleasure to have you here, and I would like to know a little bit more, a few words on your new book, Prosperity, Better Business Makes the Greater Good. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Maria, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak to you today. Both my book, Prosperity, and the British Academy Future the Corporation programme are motivated by the same consideration. That is, there is something fundamentally wrong with our economic and capitalist systems, and the problem lies at the heart of both of them, namely business. Now, business is, of course, a source of remarkable economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of growing environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. Why is this the case? At the heart of the problem lies the reason why business exists, why it is created, its reason for being, namely its purpose. Now, the purpose of business was described by Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, almost 50 years ago in what is now known as the Friedman Doctrine. And that says that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that's been the basis of business practice, business policy, and business education ever since. But it wasn't always the case. Indeed, business was established some 2,000 years ago in the form of the corporation in ancient Rome as the Societas Publicanorum. And it was established to perform very public functions of collecting taxes, minting coins, and maintaining public buildings. And for most of its 2,000-year history, it has combined a public purpose with a commercial objective of making money. It's really only the last 50 years that the only purpose of business has come to be seen to be to make money. Now, why is this the source of the problem? Well, underpinning the Friedman Doctrine is a belief in markets and regulation. Now, both markets and regulation are extremely important. And what the Friedman Doctrine relies on is the idea that competition in markets will align the private interests of shareholders in a broader societal interest. And where that fails, then regulation can intervene to correct the deficiency of markets. But unfortunately, that proposition simply does not hold and increasingly fails to hold, because increasingly we are facing companies that are not just monopolies in their own countries, but global monopolies. And companies such as Google and Facebook illustrate that, because being social networking companies, they are natural monopolies. The larger the size of the markets, the more those businesses thrive. And as such, they are not then subject to the normal rules of competition in markets. But so too does regulation fail, because regulation is often based on national formulation and therefore cannot easily cope with global entities. And furthermore, technology is increasing the problem, because technology means that regulation falls further and further behind what companies are actually doing. So there is both a failure of market efficiency and regulatory effectiveness to align companies' interests with shareholders with our interests as individuals and societies. And that void is becoming increasingly a chasm as technology accelerates. In that void, we need companies with a purpose that goes beyond just the interests of one party, namely their shareholders. We need businesses with different purposes. And that's been recognized by many people, by, for example, Larry Fink, the CEO and president of the largest investment management business in the world, Black Rock, when he said that every business needs to have a purpose, not a strapline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of its fundamental reason for being. Purpose, he said, is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force for achieving them. The Business Roundtable in August 2019 jettisoned its 1997 statement of purpose as being about shareholder primacy for one that encompasses stakeholders more generally. The World Economic Forum at the beginning of this year was all about company purpose. Now, what the pandemic has done has merely been to accentuate this importance of a corporate purpose beyond just making money. And what we're increasingly realizing is that purpose is not just about producing profits. The purpose of a business is to solve problems that you and I face as individuals, societies, and the natural world, and to find ways of solving our problems in commercially viable and profitable and financially sustainable ways. So the purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for either. That is not about philanthropy or charity, it's about hard-nosed business. It's not a marketing campaign or a woolly statement. It is a precise statement about what problems business should be solving, how they should be solving them, when they should be solving them, and why they are particularly well suited to solving their problems. In other words, it lies at the core of a business and is linked and oversees a company's strategy.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. And you've almost talked to us about all your books, so we won't buy it. So stop telling the whole trick. Okay. So Jordi, now is your turn. We are trying to see what are the purpose of corporations. So one question for you, and you just can elaborate as far as you want. Why do companies exist? Do they have only one purpose, which is the making money? Or I would like to hear more about what do you think about it.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, María Ángeles. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias a CODESPA, también al Observatorio Empresarial promovido por CODESPA y muy particularmente a ti, al presidente de CODESPA, a Isabel, a Mónica, a todos los que habéis hecho posible esta iniciativa tan importante para las empresas en España y esperemos en muchas partes del mundo. Os animamos muchísimo a que sigáis con este empeño, hoy más importante que nunca. It is also my great privilege to be here in this session with my very admired colleague and friend, Colin Meyer. Colin, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a great privilege to be able to learn from you, listen from you, in the context of this conference on inclusive growth. I would go to Colin's definition of what corporate purpose is, to think about why companies actually exist and why we expect companies to play a very dynamic role in facing some of the challenges that we have in today's society, in particular after the explosion of the pandemic in this year 2020. I think Colin has made a great effort to somehow define in a synthetic way what purpose is about. Corporate purpose should be about explaining why a company is here to try to solve some specific needs, some specific problems that some of us, many of us, all of us may face in our lives, and trying to do so with profitable solutions. So companies have to do those things in a way that can be sustainable in the long term. And sustainable does not mean only to be sustainable from a financial viewpoint, which is very important. We need to make sure that companies allocate financial resources in a very effective way, but also sustainably in terms of the relationships of companies with people, very important, with employees. We cannot just have companies with a very high turnover rate, okay? So we think that there are people outside there and companies need people who offer their professional services. So we hire people, we fire people, and we keep this cycle. And we think that because people are there available, well, we all know, we have the experience that companies cannot be run in the long term in an effective way by just hiring and firing. We need to make companies inclusive in the way we actually host people, educate people, train people, help people work together. So companies have to be sustainable also from this viewpoint, and create these type of relationships with people, sense of community, those relational contracts that some economists talk about that are based on reputation, are based on trust. So important to run companies in the 21st century, where the most important assets are not physical assets, are not machines, are not very heavy factory lines to manufacture goods. Today's economy is essentially based on intangibles. Today's economies are based on software, are based on brands, are based on professional services. All those things require, above all, some key relationships based on trust. Also, we need to make companies sustainable from the viewpoint of the impact that they have on their societies. So companies are not institutions or organizations that can, start here, close down a factory here, go there, then go to somewhere else, because companies are having an impact on society. Moreover, we need to think not just about in terms of, let's say, companies being and showing solidarity with the communities they operate in, which is a moral duty, but also we need to think that about a very basic fact. We will not have successful companies in the long term, in communities, in societies that are actually crumbling down. Companies succeed when they operate in societies that are safe, that have some legal standards that are developed and obey according to the rule of law, have good institutions that have opportunities and offer opportunities to people. So companies need to make sure that communities and societies around them actually work. And finally, I think it's very important what Colin also said before, companies and individuals as well, but companies have an environmental impact. And we need to take into account this environmental impact in the P&L statements that we actually use to estimate cost, eventually charge prices. And we need to make sure that we're not just free riders that actually use and consume natural resources, thinking that somebody else will pay for those resources. We need to be responsible citizens. And this notion of sustainability is also a very important part of why companies need to operate with a specific orientation to serve some customers' needs, some customers' challenges, but do so in a profitable way, in a sustainable way, in a way that does not harm society, does not harm people, does not harm the environment. Moreover, that takes into account the way companies interact and impact all those realities.
Between the long-term objectives and work we have to do to take care of all the stakeholders. Both of you are thinking in the same way about companies. There is not only the need to contribute to shareholders, but the whole bunch of society at the end and people that surrounds the companies. And Mr. Market asking the companies for short-term results. So just first to Colin, you've said that companies have the servility of large corporations are in the hands of the power of shareholders, and the ambition of managers and shareholders put the company at risk. Why do you think that?
That is the case because the effect of putting companies simply in the hands of their shareholders leads firms to prioritize the interests of shareholders ahead of that of any other party. And I'd like to illustrate that in relation to what's going on at the moment in regard to COVID-19. Because I think that what COVID-19 does very effectively is to illustrate the importance of companies having a clearly defined purpose, and a purpose that is more than just to make money for shareholders. Now, the reason why it accentuates that point is that, as we'll be all aware, companies around the world have received massive bailouts from governments in the form of loans, grants, and tax breaks. Now, that funding has been provided on the basis of a lot of public support for bailing out business because economies depend on it. Now, that was also true at the beginning of the financial crisis. There was a lot of public support for the bailing out of banks at the beginning of the financial crisis because our financial systems depended on it. But that support rapidly turned to derision as people realized that actually banks had seriously exploited the rest of society before the financial crisis and continued to fail to recognize their social license to operate after the crisis. Now, business this time round in this crisis cannot afford to make the same mistake, because the consequences of losing public support this time round will be much more serious than it was during the financial crisis. And I want to illustrate the conflict that business faces in relation to one specific example. You'll all be aware that there have been 3 successful vaccine trials over the last few weeks, over the last 3 weeks, by Pfizer, Moderna, and now AstraZeneca, working in conjunction with Oxford University. Now, what AstraZeneca has announced, partly because it has been working with the university, is that it's going to be selling its vaccine at cost, which is reckoned to be around about $4 a dose. Moderna, in contrast, is estimating that its vaccine will be sold probably nearly an order of magnitude more expensive at something around $30 to $40. And Pfizer is probably somewhere in between the two at perhaps $10 to $20. Now, the significance of that pricing differential is firstly, of course, in terms of how profitable the production of vaccine by the different companies will be. In the case of Moderna, it will be very profitable. In the case of Pfizer, pretty profitable. In the case of AstraZeneca, it will just cover its costs. Now, if you look at what happened on Monday of this week, when AstraZeneca announced that the trials that Oxford University have been undertaking with its vaccine have been successful in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine, you'll observe that the share price of AstraZeneca fell. It fell by approximately 4% on Monday when the announcement was made. Now, the significance of the price differential between AstraZeneca, Moderna, and Pfizer is not just in terms of profitability, but in terms of access to the vaccine around the world. Because 2 of the features of the AstraZeneca vaccine are firstly that it's priced much cheaper than the others, but secondly, that it can be stored at normal refrigerator temperature as against approximately minus 70 degrees centigrade, which the other vaccines need to be stored at. So its potential for being distributed around the world to some of the poorest nations and some of the nations that are suffering the worst effects of coronavirus is far greater than the other vaccines. But what one sees then as the reaction of financial markets to that announcement is a response that says, oh, this is a development that at best is just covering the costs of AstraZeneca, and at worst will actually lead to a reduction in the profits of the firm, certainly in relation to that of the other vaccine producers. Now here then is potentially one of the most important socially beneficial announcements that we've had, arguably for best part of 10 years, and an announcement that is greeted by the stock market with a strong measure of indifference and actually a negative reaction. Now, there's a question as to whether or not AstraZeneca's strategy is still, despite the short-term implications on its financial performance, in the long term, actually going to be beneficial to it. And for the reasons that Jordi was mentioning, arguably one could say that it's quite conceivable that it will in the long term be beneficial for AstraZeneca because it creates an immense amount of trust and goodwill in the company for doing that. And the illustration I make sometimes of that is that Novo Nordisk, a producer of insulin which is used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes, has set out a program for defeating diabetes around the world, eradicating diabetes. Now, if that program is successful in terms of really eradicating diabetes, arguably it might be expected to destroy AstraZeneca's basic business model. But actually what AstraZeneca is beginning to find is that its business is flourishing on the back of it. Why? Because in the process of working out how to defeat diabetes around the world, what it has done is to build up relations with hospitals, doctors, universities, governments, local authorities, health workers, to identify ways of treating type 2 diabetes and helping people to avoid getting type 2 diabetes through changes in their lifestyles. And in the process of building up those relations, it has become a trusted supplier of health products and health advice. Now, AstraZeneca may in the long term benefit from something similar going forward in terms of the trust that it has thereby created. But certainly the stock market's reaction, the share price incentives that it thereby encourages are not in line with our interests as individuals, societies, or the world.
Very clear example, very clear example. Only time will say, and I hope that it will help AstraZeneca to build stronger relationship with customers and with people, and that we all prefer AstraZeneca products in the near future. So after this example, Jordi, how do you think that companies like AstraZeneca could solve this tension of short-term economic return and long-term societal good impact? How could do they that?
Well, it's a very important challenge that has been highlighted, I think, in a very elegant way by the long description and rich description that Colin Mayer has offered us about how financial markets, and in this case, some hedge funds and some retail investors actually react when companies announce that perhaps for a very important long-term social orientation. They just want to cut prices down and perhaps allow for lower profits to be reported in the short term. But as Colin has expressed so well, companies are institutions that essentially are created for the long term. If you think about more traditional manufacturing companies that needed to invest, let's say, in long production lines, complex machines, R&D, none of those investments could be recouped in 2, 3, 4 years. We all expected that companies needed to, think about a much longer time horizon to make sure that that investment was going to pay off for the company and for its customers, for its people, for its shareholders. I think that for the past 3 decades, we have seen an increasing dominance of financial criteria in the business world, an increasing voice and power of financial markets, of capital markets in the business world. It has to do with a long-term change that Colin Mayer has studied deeply and very well. He's a leading authority on this as well, on how the structure of ownership has changed around the world. And we see today, especially in listed companies, in public companies, shareholders that actually control those companies and that are owned by investment funds, hedge funds, private equity, in some cases, family offices. But the fact of the matter is that in some cases, there is not a shareholder in a single company that feels somehow responsible for the long-term development of that company. And that's, I think, a serious challenge. It's a puzzle, okay? How can you have a controlling power of a company through voice, shareholders have voice, through voting, in some cases through exiting that company, so shaping in many ways some policies in that company, and have no responsibilities. So we need to actually think about it and rethink the way we actually include shareholders in the long-term development of companies. And I think part of this reaction that we're seeing in some large asset managers, as BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, and others, is that they are coming, perhaps too slowly, but they are coming to terms with this reality. There is a piece of good news here, very important, which is that we are counting today on, I would say, growing investors in terms of influence, of power, investors that are owned by or are controlled by family offices, families that are actually for the long term in that company. We also see the growing importance of sovereign funds that actually invest, and their interest also is in the long term, not the short term. So I do think that in this alignment or realignment of long-term, short-term, it's not just a question for the top management team, for CEOs, very important, they have very important responsibility. It's not only a question for boards of directors, it's how we rethink the role of shareholders, of ownership in today's society, and how shareholders, how investors think about not only generating value in the short term for them, they have a duty to create value for the savers that are actually behind them, but they cannot do this at the price of handicapping or destroying the potential that a company has to develop all these fantastic potential impact for the long term. So I do think that there is a need, okay, to reflect upon those things. We're speaking today about stewardship that shareholders need to deploy and develop regarding the companies they invest in. And certainly there are new duties that shareholders have to assume if they want to be investors, responsible investors in the 21st century economy. And it's not just for investors that want to have as a priority the environmental impact, which is, I think, very good, and we need more of them. It's for any investor. Investors need to take into account that companies are made of different stakeholders, that the board and the top management team need to build positive, constructive, collaborative relationships among the different stakeholders. And moreover, if I can put it this way, when we think about how good the purpose is for a company and how good this purpose for society is, I do think that there is a couple of stakeholders that need to be put first. I think that we need to going back to this definition offered by Colin on purpose, we need to think about customers. If there is not a customer, there's not a company. Peter Drucker, the great management thinker, put it this way: there is no company if this company does not have a customer. And we know very well that to serve customers, we need our own people, okay? Our own people, good people, talented people, people who are committed, okay, to serve those customers. So we need to realign all those stakeholders. We need to realign shareholders, investors in a very important way. And we need to make sure that they understand that a company to truly deploy its full value in the long term, they need to actually help the company invest for the long term.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think it's very important. And Colin was saying it at the very beginning. Where is the cause of the problem? And he realized it was market and regulation. And you came to the point of investors are behind every company. So the financial market, the market, is the one that also has something to say here and do. And we all know that when a CEO of a company is putting in risk one of his biggest investors, they really move towards what they wanted. These sovereign funds, these BlackRock and Vanguard funds are really able to make the difference for the company. So we still have just 5 minutes, and I will encourage the people in the audience to make questions because I think they will probably love to do them. Hacéis preguntas en el Spark Up, but I really want to do the last one for you too, and then we go to the question of the audience, and it is, why poverty and social issues have come apparently in a second place after the environment? You always explaining to us that people is first, employees, customers, people, but we have apparently forgot about people and focus our efforts in environment. Why you both think this could have happened?
Okay, perhaps I'll just have a shot at that question. So the reason why the environment has received such attention is that it's perceived to be an existential threat, quite rightly, for the world. And as a consequence, it's been the subject of an immense amount of political activism of a variety of different forms, in the form of Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, amongst many others, really giving it substantial prominence. And as a consequence of that, what one saw happening from approximately 2017 onwards was that institutional investors were beginning to recognize that the environment was not just a major social issue, but it was also a major risk class for them as investors. And that there was a real risk of the assets that they were investing in diminishing in value. And that is exactly what we have seen happening. We have seen the creation of what are termed stranded assets. That is to say, fossil fuel companies, oil production and drilling facilities, diminishing substantially in value as the perceived return on investments in them falls with a likelihood of, first of all, oil price declines, and secondly, regulation preventing them from actually accessing and selling the oil that they bring out of the ground. So what the investor community has done has been to shift the pressure on, in particular, oil companies to alter their activities in such a way as to address that particular issue. And we've seen oil companies becoming no longer oil companies. Virtually every oil company is now an energy company. And it's an energy company to help solve the world's energy problems. And that comes back to precisely the definition that I had as to what a purpose should be, namely to solve problems of people and planet, in this case, to solve our energy problems in ways that are commercially viable. And in the process, BP and Shell, both for the first time for a very long time, had to cut their dividends to be able to fund the investments that are required for them to be able to achieve that shift in the allocation of resources in their businesses. Now, the issue that the social elements, the S of ESG is against the E raises is, what is the equivalent immediacy that demonstrates to investors and then to companies that this is something that they should prioritize at an equivalent level? Well, the answer was, until the beginning of this year, it wasn't quite clear cut. But then since the beginning of this year, we have had two factors that have significantly intensified the focus on the S of ESG relative to the E, the first of which is the pandemic, which at the very least has brought the health element of S to the fore. But then a second reaction with strong political consequences has been the greater emphasis on diversity, which was previously focused on gender diversity, but with Black Lives Matter has become focused on a much broader diversity agenda. So we're beginning to see similar pressure emerging in relation to the S element, at least in some areas in regard to health and diversity. But it doesn't cover the full spectrum of S, and in particular, it doesn't cover the element that you were referring to in your question, Maria, and that is in relation to poverty. And the issue that poverty raises is, will it gain the same level of political inevitability that we've associated with environmental and health and diversity issues? Now, what I just described in relation to the AstraZeneca share price is very much indicative of the fact that here is an innovation that has phenomenal implications for the poorest people in the world, and yet is not reflected in the share price response of companies. And really what one needs to do is to ensure that those other elements of S that need to be prioritized do have a similar urgency associated with them as aspects of E and S have now come to create.
Thank you. I would like to hear your ideas, Jordi. We are still short of time, but yeah, 1 minute. We will have 1 minute.
Thank you. If I may, I would like to introduce an angle, a perspective that hopefully complements what Colin just said. I fully agree with Colin's observations and perspectives. But I do think I would like to add a dimension which is very important. You know, the question for me is how we make our society and how we make companies places where people, individuals, actually can grow as individuals, as human beings, as persons, in terms of the potential, the capacity to do things, the potential to raise a family, to progress. I do think that this is important. And the underlying assumption, indispensable to make companies flourish from a human viewpoint, to create societies and develop societies that are flourishing from a human viewpoint, is to truly believe on some very simple, very essential ethical values that need to be in place, not just at home, not just for our children, and we tell our children, look, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't lie, you should help others, etc. And then we go to the professional world, we go to our companies, we go to our institutions, and we behave in a different way. And we just assess things if financial markets tell us to do something, or if it has an impact on profitability. You know, this is crazy. I think that obviously we need to manage things in a very professional way, but without losing who we are. We are losing our personality. We're losing our humanity. And I do think that, going back to your question on the S factor, as I think it's the same for the E factor, the environmental factor, but also for social and the human, the people factor, is look, we should treat people with respect, because every person has a unique personality, some unique dignity and rights. And we need to make sure that those people, when we work together in a company, in an organization, we work as a team and we develop positive relationships. And all those things are really essential. So I think that introducing financial valuation here is important, because we need to allocate resources effectively. But there is something, I think, behind. There is something, I would say, the hidden competitive advantage of any of us is our humanity, our human values, our talent, whatever those values are, whatever. But in those values, we need to actually make sure that they help us respect others, take care of others, show our kindness to others. I think all those things are very important. They're not companies, effective organizations that do not take this into account. And eventually, capital markets will recognize this. But even if capital markets in the short term don't do it, we shouldn't change our values, because the share price is not responding to those values. I do think that values are what define us, what define our companies, what define our societies. And I think that we should put those values first. And in those values, I think the first of those values is, look, we should treat every person with a great respect, according to its unique dignity.
Here, but it has been amazing. I realize here for your speeches that we have to be optimistic, but that there are loads of work to do. So we better just start working right now. Thank you very much. It has been amazing. I will ask the audience to use the Spark app to answer some questions. We'll probably come back to them maybe with your videos, and maybe we just can ask you later on to answer some of their questions. Thank you very much, and stay connected, because this panel has been like best ever, but we still have more things to follow. So thank you too, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.